Hey math enthusiast, I'm here to continue the notes on special right triangles, and in this video I'm going to go over the rules for the 30, 60, 90 triangle. Now there are different ways to prove as to why these rules work. I'm not going to go over that in this video, but what I want you to know is that the hypotenuse is 2 times the length of the shorter leg, and the longer leg is radical 3 times the length of the shorter leg. So in this case, instead of just 2 legs and a hypotenuse, I'm going to have the short leg, the long leg, and the hypotenuse. Now we've gone over before how to identify the hypotenuse. It is across from the right angle. Now the shortest leg is always across from the smallest angle, which in this case would be the 30. My longest leg would be across from the next biggest angle, which would be the 60. So in some of these examples, it might help to label your triangle first. Where's the hypotenuse? Where's the short leg? Where's the long leg? Now, how do I find these missing parts? Well, if I'm looking for the hypotenuse, what I can do is take the short leg and just multiply it by 2. If I'm looking for the longer leg, all I have to do is take the shorter leg and multiply it by radical 3. Now, it gets a little bit more complicated if you're looking for the shorter leg. So if you have the hypotenuse, what you're going to do is just divide that by 2. Now, if you're looking for the shorter leg and you have the longer leg, you're going to have to divide that by radical 3, which gets a little bit more complicated because in that scenario, I would have to rationalize the denominator. So let's take a look at some examples. So for number 8, let's start off and label our 3 parts. Hypotenuse is easy to pick out. It's across from the right angle. I can see the 30 degree at the top right, so that means 2 is going to be my short leg. So obviously the last one, y, is going to be my long leg across from the 60. So if you recall, if I'm looking for the hypotenuse and I have the short leg, all I'm going to do is take the short leg and multiply it by 2. So in this case, I have the short leg, so let's just plug that in. So now my hypotenuse is going to be 2 times 2. So now I know my hypotenuse is going to equal 4. Now, the other piece we're looking for, obviously, is the long leg. So if you remember our rule from up above, to figure out the long leg, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the short leg and I'm going to multiply it by radical 3. Well, in this case, I have the short leg, so instead of writing short leg, I'm going to fill in the length of the short leg, which is 2, which is obviously just going to be 2 radical 3. So that's going to be my length for the long leg, or in this case, y, and I already solved for my hypotenuse, which was 4, and that equals x. So let's take a look at example 9. So I'm going to start off again by labeling my parts. It looks like my hypotenuse is the side with y on it. Since the 30 is over to the left, that means x is going to be my short leg. And then the last piece, 18, is going to be my long leg. Now, I'm missing the short leg and the hypotenuse. It's going to be easiest to get the short leg first, no matter what you have, whether it's the long leg or the hypotenuse. So if you remember, my equation to find the short leg was to take the long leg, whatever that is, and divide it by radical 3. Okay, so once again, I have the long leg, so let's plug that in. I know the long leg is 18. But in this case, I'm not finished. Because I divided by a radical, the next thing I want to do is rationalize that denominator. So I'm going to multiply it by radical 3 over radical 3, which is essentially just 1, so I'm not changing the value. But if you remember, what happens in my denominator is I end up with radical 3 times 3. So now in my denominator, I end up with radical 9. And in my numerator, I have 18 radical 3. 18 radical 3. Now, once again, radical 9 can be changed to a whole number, so I end up with 3 in my denominator. So the denominator has been rationalized, but the last thing I want to do is simplify my fraction. So I really have 18 over 3, which is just going to turn into 6. And I want to make sure I include that radical 3. So now we have our first piece. So I can plug that back into my picture up here. For the short leg, we have 6 radical 3. Now for the hypotenuse. So if you remember, our equation to solve for the hypotenuse was to just take the short leg, whatever that is, and multiply it by 2. Well, in this case, I just solved for that value, so we're going to plug that in here. So it's going to be 6 radical 3 times 2. Now, in this case, when you're multiplying these values, you can only multiply the numbers outside the radical together and the numbers inside the radical together. There's only one value inside the radical. That's radical 3. So I'm only going to be able to multiply the 6 and the 2 together. Well, after I multiply them together, that's going to turn into 12 radical 3. And that value was for y, and 6 radical 3 was for x. Okay, let's take a look at example 10. And let's start off the same way. I'll just label my parts. So it looks like 10 is obviously my hypotenuse. Now they only give me one angle here, is the 30, which means this other angle has to be 60. Now the short leg would have to be across from the 30, so that's your y. And obviously x, the last part, would have to be your long leg. So in this case, they give me the hypotenuse. First thing I'm going to go after is the short leg. Now if you remember, my equation to find the short leg was to take the hypotenuse, whatever value that is, and divide it by 2. Well, in this case, once again, I have the hypotenuse, so I'm going to plug that value in here. So I'm going to end up with 10 divided by 2. So it looks like my short leg is going to equal 5. So I can plug that into my picture to make it a little bit more easier. So y equals 5. Next up, long leg. So if you remember, the equation to find the long leg is to take the short leg, whatever that is, and multiply it by radical 3. Well, in this case, we just solved for the short leg, so that should make it easy. So I'm just plugging in 5. So my long leg is 5 radical 3. So that was the value for x. For example 11, let's start off and label our parts. It looks like they give us the short leg. That's 7 radical 3 because that's across from the 30. They don't give us the hypotenuse, but they're not actually asking for it in this case. I'm really only looking for x, which is the long leg. So in this case, I have to remember what's my equation to solve for the long leg if I have my short leg. So if you recall what it is, we just used it in the last problem. I'm going to take my short leg and I am going to multiply it by radical 3. So let's plug in what our short leg is. In this case, it is 7 radical 3. Once again, I can only multiply my radicals together. So 7 is going to stay on the outside. So I'm going to have radical 3 times 3, which is going to turn into 7 times radical 9. Well, we can simplify radical 9. That's just going to turn into a whole number 3, which tells me that my long leg is 21. So x equals 21. Now, if I wanted to, I could take it one step further and solve for the hypotenuse. If you remember what the hypotenuse is to take your short leg and multiply it by 2. Once again, we'll plug in what we have. We actually do have the short leg. it is 7 radical 3. And in this case, I can't multiply the radical 3 with anything because I don't have any other radicals. I can only multiply those whole numbers or those constants that I have outside the radical. So my hypotenuse is going to equal 7 times 2 times radical 3, which is going to give me 14 radical 3. Now for example 12, it looks like we have a little bit more going on here. We have two right triangles that are sharing this one side down the middle. So the first one I'm going to focus on is the one on the right, because they actually do give me one side length for this. So I'll redraw that over here. We have our right angle. We have 60 down here, which means I have 30 up here. They have this side labeled as y, and they give us this side, which is 6 radical 3. So let's start off the same way we started off the other problem. Let's label our sides. 6 radical 3 is the hypotenuse. I don't have the short leg, but that would be this one down here. And I don't have this side, but this is the long leg that I'm actually looking for. So in this case, unfortunately I can't just jump from the hypotenuse to the long leg. I'm going to need the short leg to get the long leg. So first let's think about solving for the short leg. If you remember what our equation is to take the hypotenuse and divide it by 2. So once again, let's just plug in what we have. So the hypotenuse in this case is 6 radical 3. Now, fortunately I can reduce this. 6 over 2 can be reduced. The radical 3 is going to stay where it is, which tells me that the short leg is actually equal to 3 radical 3. So now I can plug that into my picture. So we'll get rid of this. And for my short leg, I have 3 radical 3. Now, the piece I'm actually concerned about finding is the long leg. So in order to find the long leg, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the short leg and I'm going to multiply it by radical 3. So let's replace that with what we have for the short leg. I just found out the short leg is 3 radical 3. Well, in this case, I can actually multiply my radicals together. So I'm still going to have that 3 on the outside. And then I'm going to have 3 times radical 3 times 3, which is going to turn into 3 times radical 9, which is going to turn into 3 times 3, which tells me that the long leg is 9. So that's my value for y. So now let's go back. I can plug that into the picture that I drew on the left, and I can also plug that back into my original picture. So we said the long leg was 9, and y in here is 9. Now, I'm not done. Now I need to solve for x. So now let's focus on the next triangle. So now for this one, I do have a side length. I have 9 over here. My two angles are both 45. So I'm dealing with the 45, 45, 90, which tells me I do have two congruent sides here and here. So they're both 9, and I'm looking for x. So we'll start off, we'll label our sides. I'm looking for the hypotenuse. I have a leg here, and I have a leg here. So now we just have to recall what is our rule to solve for the hypotenuse in the 45, 45, 90. So to get the hypotenuse, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a leg and I'm going to multiply it by radical 2. So let's replace that with what we have. I know my leg is actually 9. So in this case, I know x is just equal to 9 radical 2. Now this last example is similar to the previous one. So let's start off and focus on this triangle because I actually do have that one side length at the top that's 16. So let's redraw that over here. I have the right angle here. I have 16 up here. I'm looking for F, and they give me one angle here, which is 30. Now, since I already have a right angle and I already have the 30 degrees, that means this last angle has to be 60, which will be helpful for us later. But let's continue by labeling our parts. So as I said, I have 16, which is definitely the hypotenuse. It's across from the right angle. One side I don't have that they're not asking for is the short leg across from the 30, and I'm looking for the long leg where F is. So once again, I run into the same problem that I did for the last one. I have the hypotenuse and I want the long leg. Well, what I'm going to have to do is find the short leg to get to the long leg. So first, let's remember, what is my equation to get the short leg if I have the hypotenuse? We have to take the hypotenuse and we have to divide it by 2. This one should be a little bit easier because the hypotenuse is just a whole number, 16. So now I know that my short leg is going to equal 8. Next, if I want to figure out what the long leg is, I'm going to have to take the short leg and I'm going to have to multiply it by radical 3. Well, in this case, once again, it should be pretty easy. The short leg is just a whole number, so I'll just plug that in, and it tells me that my long leg is just going to be 8 radical 3. So now I can go back and plug this information into my picture. So we have the short leg, which is 8, and the long leg, which is 8 radical 3. Now let's switch over and let's focus on the other triangle. So for this triangle on the right, they really don't give me a lot of information. But since I know I have a right angle right here, there has to be a right angle on the other side since those two angles are supplementary. So when I redraw this triangle, I have a right angle here. I'm also told that the big angle at the top is 105. Well, I already solved for part of that. That was the 60 over here. So that means the other piece that I haven't solved for yet that adds up to 105 has to be 45. So that's this 45 degree angle up here, and next to that is the 60 from the red triangle right here. Those two together obviously add up to 105. So that information just helps me confirm that the triangle that I'm looking at here is indeed the 45, 45, 90. So let's redraw it again. I have my right angle here, 45. The other angle has to be 45. Means I have two legs that are congruent. And they share this one side down the middle. So right here is a piece of both triangles. Now earlier I solved for that. That was the short leg in the 30, 60, 90, which was 8. Which means that this side down here is also 8. So that means G equals 8. The last piece they're looking for is H. So if it helps, go through and label your sides. So I'm looking for the hypotenuse, and I have both legs, 8 and 8. So let's recall what our equation is to solve for the hypotenuse. If I have a leg, I'm going to take that leg, and I'm going to multiply it by radical 2. So let's plug in what we have. As I said, my leg is 8, which means that my hypotenuse, or in this case just H, is 8 radical 2.